рабоче-крестьянская революция, о необходимости которой все время говорили большевики, совершилась!
It was the Soviet Union that tore the heart out of the Nazi war machine in World War II. The USSR is another faction that is typically very dangerous in the early going of any multiplayer game in Men of War Assault Squad. With the excellent T-34 tank series at their disposal and some very interesting hero units, the USSR can be a lethal faction. This is a 3 vs 3 Assault Zones online battle on the Frag Town Map. My teammates and I are playing as the Soviets, and our opponents are playing as the Germans. I start the game off with a unit of regular infantry. Now, many veteran players will argue that it is often a better idea to go with assault infantry rather than regular infantry as the Soviets because of the greater number of submachine gunners that come with an assault squad. The Soviet standard submachine gun is the PPSH, an excellent weapon that has a staggering 71 round clip. However, considering that I started in the middle of the map, I wanted to have more riflemen than submachine gunners because the initial firefight between my opponent and I was likely to take place at medium or long range, making riflemen more effective. And again, it is crucial to understand that the only way you're gonna win firefights in this game, especially the early ones, is by superior positioning and movement of your men. Notice how my opponent simply rushed his men across an open field to try and capture the flag in the middle of the map. This is not an arcade game. If your men are caught out in the open by a defender that is behind hard cover, such as a stone wall that my men are behind, your men will drop like flies. This is particularly true if your opponent has a machine gunner waiting to open fire on the other side. And what made matters even worse for my opponent was the fact that my teammate on my left side, Bavario, thought he was supposed to go for the center, so he sent some of his men to the center as well as a motorcycle to help repel enemy infantry. But Bavario then realizes that he's actually supposed to be posted on the left flank and quickly moves left to try and put pressure on our opponent there before he actually digs in. And as you can see here, we've managed to repel the first wave of enemy infantry and we've successfully secured the flag in the center. At this point, I don't want to be passive. I know my opponent can't have a lot of men nearby, so I'm going to try to push up to get a flanking position on his side of the field across from the center flag point. And so I'm going to put a few men in these houses over here to do just that. But at the same time, I'm going to try to harass the enemy on my right by going for his flag point. Remember, this is a team game. You should always look for opportunities to support your nearby teammates. This is because your opponent will usually only account for the player facing him and not for anyone else. So if you can sneak in a flank shot with a tank, or even cap one of his points while he's busy fighting your teammate, you can cause him a lot of trouble, which will often tip the balance of the battle in your favor. Now, some of you might be wondering how to actually occupy buildings with your infantry and shoot out of their windows. The best way to do this is to simply select the soldier you want to occupy the building and then scroll over one of the windows in the building. The cursor should change its icon to a little arrow pointing into a rectangle. If you now left click, the soldier will automatically enter the building and go to that window. If fire at will is on, he will automatically break the glass of the window and shoot at any enemy soldiers that come within his line of sight. At this point, my opponent brings up a heavy machine gun. Heavy machine guns can be very useful at defending flag points, if you position them correctly. However, my opponent is not in a position to defend. He needs to attack. He needs to push up on the center to try and retake it, so getting a heavy machine gun at this point wasn't exactly a very good idea. However, its presence does threaten my infantry, so I brought up a BT-7A. The BT-7A is a light tank that is perfectly designed for infantry support. The BT fires its rounds in an arc-like fashion, making it possible to fire at enemy positions from behind cover. It fires very good highly explosive shells, but lacks both armor-piercing rounds and has paper-thin armor, which makes it extremely vulnerable to any sort of enemy armor. I continued to bombard the enemy positions with HE rounds, and I eventually managed to decrew the heavy machine gun. But I've made two mistakes with this tank. The first mistake is actually bringing up a BT-7A. The Soviets shine with their medium tanks, namely the T-34-76 and the T-34-85. If I had waited just a little longer, I would have been able to roll up a T-34-76, which can devastate the enemy and let you push up aggressively. The second mistake I made was actually allowing my BT-7A to linger in the same position for too long. My opponent quickly reacted by bringing up a Lux, which is a German light tank, and managed to shred the thin armor protecting my tank. When you're using light tanks, you need to constantly be on the move. Don't stay in one position, or the enemy will quickly find a way to dispose of your precious little tank. At this point, I brought up a Soviet Spetsnaz, which is one of the Soviet hero units. The Spetsnaz is a very stealthy elite soldier who comes with a flare gun that has 2 flares. When these flares are shot out of position, red smoke is popped, and a lethal off-screen artillery strike that has pinpoint accuracy hits the area of the red smoke. The smoke stays on screen for a few seconds before disappearing, so if your opponent sees the smoke, he will typically try to keep his units away from it. I tried to call in an artillery strike on the Lux, but my opponent saw the red smoke and moved his light tank forward. This gave our teammate on the right flank, Mr. Kenneth, a perfect opportunity to bring up his anti-tank rifleman to get some shots on the light tank. The Soviet anti-tank rifleman carries a weapon that is capable of penetrating the armor of most light tanks when shooting at them at medium to close range. With the Lux out of the picture, we can now safely assume that our opponent in the center of the map won't be rolling up any medium tanks anytime soon. However, the enemy continues to pour infantry on the right to try and recapture the flag point that Kenneth and I have taken from it. Now, when you're in a firefight with the enemy at close range, it is very important to use your grenades. Proper use of grenades can do you wonders and often strains the enemy's micromanagement. You can always use a grenade by clicking on the grenade icon in the taskbar, but that takes a precious second of your time, which can make a big difference sometimes. Therefore, you should use your hotkeys. By default, the hotkey for a hand grenade is F1, the hotkey for an anti-tank grenade is F2, and the hotkey for a smoke grenade is F3. Memorize these hotkeys and start using them now if you don't already. Now in the center of the map, I've brought up a lot of units. I now have a unit of guard snipers, which consists of 2 snipers that come in a jeep. I have some guard rifles, and I also have a T-34-76. The T-34 tank is the pride of the Soviet army. It boasts an excellent combination of speed, armor, and firepower, and can often take on any enemy medium tank with ease. It is always worth saving up for this tank right after you bring up your first squad of infantry in the early going, because this gives you a window of opportunity where you can push aggressively on the enemy. Remember, I brought up a BT-7A instead, and so I delayed the T-34. By doing this, I've ruined my window of opportunity of tank superiority, because the chances are my other opponents can have tank destroyers, like the Hetzer. Now I mentioned that I brought up a unit of guard snipers. This is one of my favorite Soviet hero units. Each unit of guard snipers consists of 2 snipers who arrive in a jeep. It is very important that you make sure you don't send the jeep to the front line and then forget about it, because if it gets destroyed, the chances are the snipers inside are going to get killed. So what you should do is drive the jeep to a safe position on the map and then take the snipers out by using the drop-off key. I'm not sure what the drop-off key is by default, but I've set the hotkey for drop-off to G. So all you have to do is hit that key and then click anywhere on the map to make the snipers come out. A pair of well-positioned guard snipers can quickly decimate an enemy's defensive position. These guys can aim and fire at an amazing rate, which means that they can pick off enemy units very quickly. Just remember that you should never keep them in the same position for too long, because when the snipers fire, they reveal their position for a second, and if the enemy is watching, he may find them and try to kill them with a tank or artillery, or even counter-snipe them. And over here I've lost my T-34 in an insane explosion, thanks to a nice hit from an enemy Panzer IV-G on the other side of the field. The reason this happened is because I popped out of cover and fired a round at the Panzer IV, but I accidentally had an HE round loaded, and so all I did was kill one of the crew members. When the Panzer IV-G fired back, it blew up my tank, probably because the shell went through the ammo store. And this is another thing I love about Assault Squad. Tank combat is not that predictable. Almost anything can happen. An armor-piercing round can do anything from bounce off a tank to make it explode. Obviously, with time and experience and a sound knowledge of what your tank can do and what it can't do, you eventually get the hang of it. And over here I brought up an Su-85, a Soviet tank destroyer. These tank destroyers specialize at engaging enemy tanks at long range, where they can fire and successfully penetrate the enemy's armor without having to face any effective return fire. The Su-85 should never be used in medium or close combat because its armor is not that thick, so extra care should be taken to keep them at maximum firing distance to keep them as safe as possible. Another thing about most tank destroyers is that they usually don't come with a turret. That means if they lose one of their tracks, they become sitting ducks because their field of fire becomes so limited without a turret to turn their guns. Another thing you should be very familiar with in this game is the right click and drag movement order. Assuming that you've set the left mouse button to give orders, by clicking on the right mouse button with the vehicle selected and then dragging, you can order that unit to move to a specific point and then face in any direction you like when it gets to that point. This is a very useful command and you should definitely start using it if you don't already. You should also keep in mind that vehicles have two modes of movement. They can drive to their destination at normal speed, or they can sprint, so to speak. To make a vehicle sprint, all you have to do is double click on the destination rather than clicking once. And over here I've brought up a unit of Black Coats. The Black Coats are a Soviet hero unit that costs 3 special points. This unit consists of Soviet Marines who come in a half-track with a 50 cal machine gun on it. This hero unit is often the perfect way to grab an enemy position right after you've taken care of the enemy's tanks. The Marines are an excellent fighting force, and the 50 cal machine gun on the half-track can decimate enemy troops as well as any light vehicles nearby. So I've taken control of the flag point in this little patch of woods here on the left flank to put even more pressure on the enemy who is fighting my teammate Bavario in the airfield on the very far left. Again, supporting your teammates is vital, especially when you're in the center position of the map. When you spawn in the center, it is usually a lot smarter to hold your ground and then help push on one of the flanks with your teammates rather than pushing forward yourself. This is because if you push forward too much in the center, you risk forming a salient in the enemy defensive line, and your troops can then get flanked from the left or right. So if you're doing really well in the center, help your allies on the left or right, don't push forward in the center. Anyway, my opponent decides to bring up some more troops to try to counterattack and recapture the flag in the forest on the left. So I bring up another T-34-76 to quickly deal with his troops. The T-34-76 is very useful in the early game, but towards the end of the game, it kind of loses its effectiveness because usually by then the enemy has heavier tanks that can easily take it out. The other amazing T-34 tank that the Soviets have at their disposal is the T-34-85. This tank is similar to the T-34-76 in terms of armor and speed, but the difference lies in the gun. The gun on the 85 is a beast and can take on almost all but the heaviest tanks in the game. Just make sure that you use the T-34-85 very carefully, because its armor does not match up well with most late game enemy tanks. The best way to use a T-34-85 is to use it opportunistically. Keep it hiding behind cover. Once a juicy target exposes its flank to you, pop out of your hiding spot and try to get a nice flank shot. Just remember, the T-34-85 doesn't have amazing armor, so in a face-to-face fight with a heavier tank like a German Tiger, the 85 is very vulnerable. Another awesome Soviet hero unit is the dual T-34-85. For 6 special points, you instantly get 2 T-34-85s with a few soldiers riding on top of them. This is the perfect hero unit to call in when your enemy has tank superiority and you need to quickly even the odds. The best way to use these 2 tanks is probably to use them one at a time, keeping one in reserve away from the front line. You won't be able to properly micromanage both tanks effectively by yourself, so if you really need both of them to take part in combat at the same time, you're probably better off giving one of the tanks to your allies. You can do this by selecting one of the tanks and then clicking on the Give Unit button in the top right corner of the screen, which is found right under the clock, and then choosing the name of the player you wish to give the tank to. Anyway, good game to our opponents, Godwin 88 and Beastcaps 1941. I told them that I'd be recording this, and they asked for a shout out, so here it is. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about this game, I highly recommend the website gamereplays.org. The website used to have a wealth of knowledge for the original Men of War, but the website is now setting up a Men of War Assault Squad section, so check it out for some cool strategies, tips and tricks, and some general Assault Squad discussions. I also highly recommend you join the Mumble server that belongs to Clan Epic. Mumble is the equivalent of TeamSpeak or Ventrilo, and Clan Epic is running a public server where anyone is welcome to join. If you're new to the game, you should definitely pop them a visit. They're really friendly and are willing to help players of all skill levels. Check the description box for more details. Anyway, thank you for watching, and don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe.